Welcome to Life Cycle Talks, a series of talks presenting the research front to keep you up to date with the science and application of the life cycle perspective. Today's Life Cycle Talk is how can we reach a sustainable consumption? And we will increase our awareness about how to measure and move towards sustainable consumption and the importance of the life cycle approach for the role of reaching a sustainable consumption. My name is Sarah Palander, and I'm happy to welcome our guest for today, Göran Finnveden, professor at KTH Royal Institute of Technology, and also visiting researcher at Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology. Warm welcome, Göran. Before we start, I just want to inform about some practical information. All Life Cycle talks will be published and available on Swedish Life Cycle Center YouTube channel. And the raise hand function will not be used in life cycle talks. So back to you, Göran. I'm curious about you. You have extensive experience as a researcher in the field of life cycle assessment. And today you work as a program director for a consumption research center. Can you tell us more about how you ended up in that role?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, obviously, life cycle perspective is very important when you work with sustainable consumption. The importance of the life cycle perspective is fundamental when you talk about sustainable consumption and make decisions in order to avoid shifting environmental impacts from one place to another, or from one type of impact to another, or from one time to another. So this describes why the life cycle perspective is important. Today I'll talk about some results from 3 different research programs, 2 which have been finalized and 1 which is ongoing. The first I will talk about is called the PRINCE project. PRINCE stands for Policy Relevant Indicators for Consumption and Environment. It was a project involving many people from Chalmers, from Stockholm Environment Institute, and also from Norway and the Netherlands, and we at KTH were also involved. In this project, we developed the PRINCE model for calculating consumption-based emissions for a country. So whenever you see, and this method is now used to produce Swedish official statistics for consumption-based emissions of greenhouse gases. So whenever you see any results about or discussions about Sweden's green consumption-based emissions, they have used the PRINCE model to calculate them. And in this PRINCE model, we combine data from the system of environmental and economic accounts produced by Statistics Sweden. So that's annual statistics that are produced regularly and part of Sweden's statistical system. We combine this data with a multi-regional environmentally extended input-output analysis model. So long name. An input-output analysis model is, of course, from the start an economic tool to describe how different sectors of society trade with each other. And using input-output analysis, we can describe which sectors in society are required to produce different products. And by including also environmental information here, we get environmentally extended input-output analysis. And then we can also calculate the emissions, the environmental impacts from producing different product groups. And by also including the multi-regional perspective, we can see also different parts of the world, which parts of the world that contribute to the consumption in Sweden and the environmental impacts from this consumption. So here we combine good data for Sweden with data from the rest of the world using these different types of models and data sources. I could add that the XR-based model, we use the XR-based model here, but it can be changed. If for some reason in the future we think that, or Statistics Sweden thinks that there is another better available model, they can change it and still keep the overall model framework. So the focus here was on greenhouse gases, but we produced results also for a range of other environmental impacts, and I'll give a few examples of this. But this is for the greenhouse gases. We show here the emissions from Swedish consumption in ton of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita and year from 2008, and here the results are from 2018, and we can see the results. The emissions have declined slightly from around 11 ton per capita and year to around 8 or 9 ton per capita in year. So there is a reduction by time trend of reduction, but it is not fast enough to be in line with the climate targets. We also see here types of emissions that are related to this. The bottom blue here is public consumption. The orange is investments. The gray is private consumption of food, and then private consumption of transport, private consumption of housing, and other private consumption categories. So that was greenhouse gases. This is another example of nitrogen oxides from Swedish consumption. Here we also show domestic part. That's the emissions that occur in Sweden because of Swedish consumption. And we can see that the majority of emissions occur outside Swedish borders. And this is typical for most of the impacts that we looked at. Here is a material use is an example where the impacts have not decreased during the time period that we looked at. In the project, we also developed some new indicators for hazardous chemicals. We looked at the use of hazardous chemicals, chemical products, use of pesticides, use of veterinary medicines, emissions of hazardous substances, and impacts of those emissions. For all of these categories, we can see that the use and emissions are lower in Sweden compared to the rest of the world. But interestingly enough, if we look at the value added, where the money ends up, we can see that most of the money ends up in Sweden. So this is interesting from an environmental justice perspective, that the emissions, the impacts occur in other countries, but the money ends up in Sweden mostly. We have lately also developed a time series for one of these indicators, the use of hazardous chemical products, and we can see that it is increased quite a lot. The use of hazardous chemical products for the Swedish consumption has increased during this time period. We can also see the dark blue here at the bottom is the use that occurs in Sweden in order to provide for Swedish consumption. So it is by far the most important country, but still the majority occurs in other countries. We can also see that most of these countries are actually European Union countries. Up to this dark blue here are EU countries. So that shows that the European Union policies in relation to chemicals is very important. So that was what I was going to talk about, the PRINCE project, which then as a result provided indicators and methods for measuring the environmental impacts of Swedish consumption in a life cycle perspective. The other project I would like to talk about is scenarios for a sustainable built environment. In this project, we did many things, but one of the things we did was development of 4 backcasting or target fulfilling scenarios for Sweden in 2050. And the targets, we used 4 targets, one related to climate, consumption based. And the target here was 0.82 tons of carbon dioxide per capita in year. So we can compare that with the previous results, which were around 8 or 9 ton. It's a very large reduction. And this number was calculated based on what some of the scenarios for reaching a 1.5 degree target. If we divide those global emissions equally among all citizens, that would be 0.82 tons per year. The land use was also a consumption-based target. And then we had 2 social targets, which were then looking more at the situation in Sweden, that all residents should be entitled to participation and influence in political choices. And the fourth target then, that residents in Sweden should have sufficient access to resources and service that can create opportunities for housing, education, social care, and social security, and a good health. And those of you who know the Swedish Constitution by heart will recognize these formulations. These are things that are written in our Constitution requirements for Swedish government. So we developed 4 backcasting scenarios for the year 2050. They are very different. The first one is called collaborative economy. Here, citizens are sharing governance and sharing resources, goods, time, and skills, and prosumer networks. So very much based on the sharing economy ideas. The second one, very much based on circular economy ideas, circular economy in the welfare state, where we assume a governance situation where the government rules, but supported by the industry, much reuse and repair in line with circular economy ideas. The third, very different, local self-sufficiency. Here, much of the things we use are produced in households, in locally governed communities. And the fourth, again, very different, automation for quality of life. Here, we're looking at robots producing while citizens enjoy leisure time. So here we have assumed a much lower working hours than we have today. And the idea here is then these scenarios are for sustainable building and planning that do not have to be reliant on economic growth. If we look into future scenarios and the economic development, it's typically assume a constant economic growth measured as GDP of 2% per year. Here we didn't assume that. Instead, we started from these different scenarios, and then the GDP growth can be whatever it turns out to be. So we did a number of different things in these scenarios. We looked at the type of governance, etc. But we also looked at the consumption patterns and then the emissions related to that. So the question we were asking was sort of, do the scenarios fit into the emission quota? And here we did not include any potential negative emissions, are not included, so these are just emissions as they occur. And they are basically within the quota. It's a little bit above here, but given the enormous uncertainties, that they can be considered to be within the quota. And the different consumption categories, we can see how they develop. Blue at the bottom is food consumption. It's a little bit different in the different scenarios. Actually, we assumed vegan food, plant-based food in these 3 scenarios. Only local self-sufficiency there were also meat assumed in the diet. For buildings and housing, there were also changes in consumption patterns, the space we are using, but we also assume quite a lot of increased energy efficiency, etc. The gray is transportation, very different in the different scenarios, but one common thing is that there was in all scenarios a reduced use of car transportation, private cars. And actually we did not assume any international aviation at all, simply because it was difficult to fit in within the quota. Then other private consumption differs in the different scenarios, and here we use the PRINCE data to calculate these consumption emissions, but modifying them in order to fit within the different scenarios. And the blue is public consumption, and that is quite different in the different scenarios because of the role of the type of governance is quite different. As I said, vegan food and no international aviation, but on the other hand, we didn't include any potential negative emissions. So if we can assume some negative emissions, that can be used in order to balance up different types of diet and different types of transportation as well. Some reflections on this. Radical changes are necessary in order to fit within this quota, but also possible. There is no specific limitations that hinders these types of developments. What we think was quite an interesting result was that different people have very different opinions about the scenarios. It turned out that many people have very strong opinions about that only one of the scenarios would at all be realistic and the others completely unrealistic. But then we talked to another person who said, no, this other scenario is the only one that is potentially realistic and the others completely unrealistic. So different people have very different opinions about the scenarios. We should also think about that the scenarios are for 2050, so these changes doesn't need to occur now, but within this time frame. In all scenarios, actually, technological development is key. It's very important, but slightly different in the different scenarios. But of course, it's not enough. Also, these behavioral changes are important and necessary. And of course, these are just 4 scenarios out of many possible. So there are enormous potential of which types of scenarios that can be developed. The third project I would like to talk about is the program Mistra Sustainable Consumption from Niche to Mainstream, which I'm program director of, but also leading that together with Jörgen Larsson at Chalmers Technical University, and also Lund University is very important in this program. And the idea is here that we have currently an unsustainable mainstream practices, but there are also in society some more sustainable niche practices. And the idea is, of course, that we need to change this and make the sustainable practices mainstream and the unsustainable niche practices. So how to make that change? That's the focus of this program. What levers, how can we make the change? I'm working in the program now in phase 2. I was not so much involved in the phase 1, which ended last year, but I will show some examples of results that we have from the first phase. For example, 40% of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions possible within what is available on the market now. And we only looked at food, holiday traveling, and furniture. I think this is interesting because we often talk about the technological development that is necessary, the investments that are necessary, and they are. But there is also a possibility to reduce emissions significantly with what is available now. But it is not enough. We need to reduce more, so more fundamental changes are also needed. And therefore, we're also looking at sufficiency strategies, for example, work time reduction schemes, which can lead to enhanced well-being. We're also looking at business models and seeing that some more sustainable business models are used and of interest to consumers more because they have social and functional values rather than the environmental reasons, actually. And we also look at policy acceptance. What kind of policy instruments can people accept? And we see then that fairness, effectiveness, and targeting of companies are keys for public acceptance of policies. So that's important to bear in mind. And here's just some examples of projects during phase 2, which is ongoing. We're testing new practices. We are doing public policy experiments. We're continuing the research and acceptance of policies. We're looking at the role of knowledge, and we look at macroeconomic impacts of sustainable consumption, and also the role of offsetting for a sustainable consumption. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Göran, for your presentation. And now I have some questions for you. So do you know how the results have been used so far? Well, in different ways for the different projects, I would say.
For the PRINCE project, as I said, this is now official statistics for Sweden. And some of you may have familiarized yourself with the public inquiry that was published by Miljömålsberedningen. What's that in English? The environmental goals public inquiry. They suggested earlier this year that we should introduce having consumption-based climate targets, and that inquiry is very much based on the results from the PRINCE project, the methods and the insights from there. For the other projects, it's completely different. I know that the Beyond GDP project has really inspired a lot of discussions and changes in different parts of Sweden, but it's difficult to see direct policy implications yet.
Thanks. And could you see some other countries be inspired by this project and adapt it to in their own national goals and so on?
Yes, I think if we would introduce a consumption-based climate goal, I think that would be an inspiration for many other countries as well. Actually, there seems Sweden is probably not the first one country. There is a goal in Germany as well, but together we can help and inspire other countries. I think that's important.
Mm. And during all these years, what has been the most important key learnings in this research field?
Well, I think some important learning. One important learning is that I touched upon, that technological development is absolutely essential for reaching a more sustainable society, but that it is not enough. If we look at different sectors, there also need to be different types of behavioral changes, for example, related to traveling and food. We often see these changes as something dramatic, but I think we can learn from history that there has been a lot of changes. I often refer to the practice of smoking. When I started my career, it was still okay to smoke in the offices of the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, IVL, where I started my career. That would be completely impossible to do that now. And I think that's a lifestyle change that many of us have gone through, which is not problematic or difficult. It has been good in many ways. In the program, one type of results which I didn't present, which I think is interesting, is that we studied the health impact of a changed diet. And if I remember correctly now, from the top of my head, reducing the use of red meat by 50% would save approximately $1 million. So 1 million disability adjusted life years. So that is a significant change also in reduced health impacts. So this kind of lifestyle changes have often win-win situations.
And you touched upon it about behavioral changes. Do you see what other challenges do you see, and where is further research needed?
I think further research is needed in a number of areas. I think it's important to better understand how transitions occur. What can we learn from history? And what kind of changes can help move things forward. I think also it's important to continue discussion about future societies, how building scenarios for that, how can a more sustainable society look like. But I also think it may be interesting to build scenarios for unsustainable societies? What kind of lifestyle changes would we have in a 4-degree society or a 3-degree society? Because when we discuss future scenarios and lifestyle changes, we tend to compare with the current situation, which will not be the future situation. We know that changes will come, whether we want them or not. Changes will come. So it's not good to compare with the current situation. We should also compare with future changes, future societies if we don't make the changes.
And how is the life cycle community and life cycle experts and researchers involved in these in this research ahead?
I think the life cycle community is very important here. I mean, it's as I started by saying, when we are making decisions about sustainable consumption, we need to have a life cycle perspective. And it's therefore very important that the life cycle community is working on these issues and looking into different product groups, different sectors of society, and looking at different potential changes. And it's important also to have a broader perspective looking. We in the life cycle community tend to look at rather small things, small changes, marginal changes. But we see now that we need to have non-marginal changes. So it's important also to look at these non-marginal changes and include that in our studies, which of course make the studies more difficult. It's easier to look at a tiny change. I think also we should be aware of the risk because we know it's difficult to do prospective LCAs, to do LCAs of future scenarios. We tend to underestimate the changes and overestimate the environmental impacts of future technologies. So there is a risk that the life cycle community becomes a conservative force, being a defensive, that LCA is used as a defensive tool against changes. So we must be aware of that risk and try to avoid it.
I have a last question. We have many industrial companies listening to the talk today. And what do you want to say to them? Any first step or action points you can give them?
Well, I mean, obviously, changes are necessary in order to fulfill different types of sustainability target. So first step is, of course, to look at the products the companies are selling. Are they suitable in a more sustainable society, or do we need to develop products and services that fit into a more sustainable society? Then, of course, to remember that companies are consumers as well, not only producing things, but also buying things. So we need to look into more sustainable consumption for the producing companies as well.
Thank you, Göran Finnveden, professor at KTH Royal Institute of Technology.
Thank you.
So if you're interested to learn more about the field of sustainable consumption, you will find more information on the research program's respective websites: Beyond GDP Growth, Scenarios for Sustainable Building and Planning, and Mistral Sustainable Consumption, From Niche to Mainstream. And here we have selected 2 publications: New Methods and Environmental Indicators Supporting Policies for Sustainable Consumption in Sweden, and also Futures Beyond GDP Growth. And as Göran said, this research has been developed together with many other colleagues, and here you can see also some of the names. So please feel free to contact Göran for questions, and here you can see his email address. And life cycle talks are published by the Innovation Cluster for the Life Cycle Perspective and Swedish Life Cycle Center. Next talk will be given on October 18 within the field of social life cycle assessment. And to ensure you don't miss this, follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletters. Thanks for listening.